I remember the way her voice sounded when she said it. Soft enough that no one else could hear, sharp enough to cut straight through me. After tomorrow, you're not part of this family anymore. For a moment I thought I had misunderstood. That maybe stress had twisted her words into something crueler than she intended. But the way she smiled told me I had heard perfectly. I stood there holding the scrapbook I had spent weeks making, my hands trembling as if the pages themselves had suddenly grown too heavy to carry. I wanted to ask her why. I wanted to demand an explanation. Instead, I felt small, like a guest who had overstayed her welcome in a place that used to be home. That night I didn't sleep. I kept replaying every moment that had led us there. Daniel's first steps across our tiny apartment floor. His laughter echoing when he lost his first tooth. The nights I sat beside him while he studied because he said he focused better when I was near. I remembered working double shifts, coming home smelling like coffee and bleach, and still finding the energy to help him with homework because I promised myself he would never feel abandoned. The way I had when his father left. And now the woman he loved had decided that I was nothing more than an obstacle to be removed. Morning came too quickly. The dress I bought for the wedding hung on the closet door, like a reminder of a life I wasn't invited to anymore. I made coffee, but it tasted bitter no matter how much sugar I added. My phone buzzed again and again with messages from relatives asking where I was. From Daniel telling me he couldn't wait to see me. From my sister asking if I needed a ride. I stared at the screen until the words blurred. Every instinct told me to go, to smile, to pretend everything was fine. But something inside me had cracked. I couldn't sit there and celebrate with someone who had already erased me from the future she imagined. When the church bells began to ring, I stayed home. I folded laundry that didn't need folding, wiped down countertops that were already clean. Anything to keep my mind from picturing Daniel standing at the altar looking for me. Guilt pressed against my chest, heavy and relentless. I whispered apologies into the silence, hoping somehow he could feel them wherever he was. The call came just after noon. My sister's voice was shaking so badly I could barely understand her. "Margaret, the wedding, it's over." At first I thought she meant it had finished early. That maybe I had simply missed everything. But then she told me about the photos, about the confrontation, about the way Daniel had stood in front of everyone and called it off. I sat down slowly, trying to process the words. Relief and heartbreak tangled together inside me until I couldn't tell them apart. He came to my house that evening still wearing his suit, his tie hanging loose around his neck. The moment I opened the door he looked like the little boy who used to run into my arms after a bad day at school. "Mom," he said, his voice cracking. I pulled him into a hug before he could say anything else. He smelled like cologne and church incense and heartbreak. "I'm sorry I wasn't there," I whispered into his shoulder. "I'm sorry I didn't see it sooner," he replied. We sat at the kitchen table for hours, neither of us eating the food I had prepared. He told me everything, the photos, the arguments, the way Jessica tried to twist the truth even when confronted with proof. He told me he finally understood why I always seemed uneasy around her, why my smiles sometimes looked forced. I didn't say I had been afraid to tell him the truth, because I didn't want to lose him. I didn't say how many nights I had cried quietly after he left with her, because I felt like I was being slowly replaced. In the days that followed, the world outside our little house turned noisy and cruel. Social media posts painted me as a villain. Strangers judged me without knowing a single detail about my life. I tried to ignore it, but sometimes I would read the comments and feel my chest tighten. Daniel told me to stay offline, to let him handle everything. Still, it hurt to see people believe the worst about me so easily. One afternoon I found him sitting on the porch staring at nothing. "Do you hate me for not coming?" I asked softly. He shook his head. "I hate that she made you feel like you couldn't." Those words healed something inside me I didn't realize was still broken. Jessica didn't disappear quietly. She sent long messages accusing me of manipulating Daniel, of ruining her future. At first I ignored them, but then the legal threats began. Letters filled with complicated words arrived in the mail, trying to scare us into silence. Daniel looked exhausted every time he opened one. I hated seeing him carry stress that should never have existed in the first place. One evening he brought over a stack of papers. "Look at this," he said. It was the prenup she had insisted on. I read through the clauses slowly, my stomach turning as I realized how much of his future income would have been tied to her family's accounts. It felt less like a marriage agreement and more like a financial trap. "I feel stupid," he admitted quietly. "You trusted someone you loved," I said. "That's not stupidity. That's being human." The more truth surfaced, the more people began to question the story Jessica had spread. Friends who had avoided me started reaching out again, apologizing for believing rumors. Some even came by with food or flowers, awkward but sincere. I realized that while lies can spread quickly, the truth has a quieter power that lasts longer. Weeks passed. Daniel started working at his new law firm, throwing himself into cases that reminded him why he wanted to be a lawyer in the first place. He came home late some nights, tired but determined. Sometimes we would sit together watching old movies, laughing at scenes we had memorized years ago. Slowly, the heaviness in our home began to lift. One night he brought out the scrapbook I had hidden under my bed. "I found this," he said gently. "Why didn't you give it to me?" I hesitated before answering. "I thought you didn't need reminders of me anymore." He opened the first page and ran his fingers over a photo of himself as a toddler, covered in cake frosting. "I've always needed you," he said. We turned the pages together, remembering birthdays, school plays, the day he graduated. Each memory felt like proof that nothing anyone said could erase the bond we had built over decades. Months later, when the noise of the cancelled wedding finally faded, I realized something unexpected. I wasn't angry anymore. The pain had softened into a quiet understanding that sometimes losing what you thought you wanted is the only way to see what truly matters. Daniel asked me one evening if I regretted staying home that day. I thought about it for a long time before answering. "Part of me wishes I had been there to hold your hand when everything fell apart," I said. "But another part of me knows that if I had gone, I might still be pretending everything was fine." He nodded slowly. "Maybe things happened the way they needed to." We sat together in comfortable silence, the kind that only exists between people who have survived storms side by side. The house felt warmer than it had in years, filled not with the tension of trying to please someone else, but with the steady rhythm of healing. One afternoon, while watering the plants in the backyard, I caught myself smiling for no reason at all. The future that once felt uncertain now looked wide open, not defined by someone else's expectations. Daniel's laughter drifted through the open window as he talked on the phone with a friend. His voice lighter than it had been in months. For the first time since that night at the rehearsal dinner, I didn't feel like an outsider looking in on my own life. I felt like myself again. A mother who had loved fiercely, sacrificed endlessly, and finally learned that being part of a family isn't something anyone else gets to decide. And as the sun set behind the trees, casting long golden shadows across the yard, Daniel stepped outside and wrapped an arm around my shoulder. "You know," he said quietly, "when she told you that you weren't part of my family anymore, she was wrong." I leaned my head against his shoulder, feeling the steady beat of his heart. "I know," I whispered. "I always was. And I always will be." The weeks after everything happened felt strangely quiet, like the world had taken a deep breath and finally decided to slow down. Daniel spent more time at my house than he had in years. Sometimes he came by just to sit at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, scrolling through case files, while soft music played in the background. Other times he showed up without warning, carrying takeout containers and insisting we eat together like we used to when he was younger. One evening he arrived looking exhausted, his shoulders tense under his coat. I could tell something was wrong before he even spoke. He dropped his bag by the door and leaned against the counter, staring at the floor. "They're still talking about it," he said quietly. "At work. Not in a cruel way, but people know." I walk into a room and conversations stop for a second. I set a plate in front of him and sat down across from him, People are curious, I said gently. But curiosity fades. Character doesn't. He gave a small, tired smile. You always know what to say. I don't always, I admitted. I just know you'll get through this. For a long moment we ate in silence. The clock ticked softly on the wall. And outside the wind rustled through the trees. It reminded me of the nights when he was a child. When storms would roll in, and he would crawl into my bed because thunder scared him. Back then I had always told him that storms never last forever. Now I realized I had been saying it as much for myself as for him. A few days later, a letter arrived addressed to Daniel. He opened it slowly, his expression tightening as he read. Another threat, he said, handing it to me. Jessica's father was demanding compensation for the cancelled wedding, claiming emotional distress and financial losses. The words felt heavy, cold, like they were meant to intimidate rather than resolve anything. Daniel ran a hand through his hair. I'm so tired of this, Mom. I reached across the table and squeezed his hand. Then let's stop letting them control the story. He looked at me, surprised. I mean, we live our lives, we don't hide. We don't argue with strangers online. We just keep moving forward. He nodded slowly, as if the idea of simply living felt more powerful than any legal battle. That weekend we cleaned out the garage together. Old boxes filled with school projects and forgotten toys made us laugh more than either of us expected. At one point he found a drawing he had made when he was 8. A stick figure version of the us holding hands, under a crooked sun. I used to think you were a superhero, he said, chuckling. Used to, I teased. He shook his head. Still do? The words warmed me more than he probably realized. As the seasons began to shift, small changes crept into our lives. Daniel started jogging in the mornings. Something he said helped clear his mind. I picked up gardening again, planting flowers along the fence line. There was a calmness between us that felt new. Like we were learning how to exist, not just as mother and son bound by struggle, but as two people who genuinely enjoyed each other's company. One afternoon he invited me to his office building for lunch. Walking into that space, seeing him greet colleagues with confidence and ease, filled me with a quiet pride I couldn't put into words. He introduced me simply as my mom. But the way he said it carried respect, not obligation. For years I had feared being pushed to the edges of his life. Instead, I realized I had always been at its center. Later that evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sky turn pink and gold, he spoke again about Jessica. Not with anger this time, but with a kind of distant understanding. I think I loved who I thought she was, he admitted. Not who she actually turned out to be. That happens more often than people admit, I said softly. Sometimes we fall in love with a future we imagine. He nodded, staring out at the horizon. Do you think I'll trust someone again? Yes, I said without hesitation. Because despite everything, you still believe in people. That's your greatest strength. The legal threats eventually faded when they realized Daniel wouldn't be bullied into public apologies or settlements. Without drama to feed on, the rumors lost their momentum. Life returned to something almost normal. One evening, months after the cancelled wedding, Daniel surprised me by cooking dinner himself. The kitchen filled with laughter as he struggled to follow a recipe, burning the first batch of pasta and nearly setting off the smoke alarm. We ended up eating takeout anyway, sitting on the floor surrounded by dishes. You know, he said suddenly, I used to think getting married was the moment life really started. And now? I asked. Now I think life has been happening all along, he replied. I watched him as he spoke, seeing not just my son but a man shaped by experience, resilience, and a deeper understanding of love. As winter approached, we decorated the house together for the holidays. It felt different this year, lighter, quieter, more honest. We didn't talk much about the past anymore. Instead, we focused on small joys, baking cookies, watching old movies, sharing stories that made us laugh until our sides hurt. One night, as snow fell softly outside, Daniel handed me a small wrapped box. Inside was a silver locket with a tiny engraving of a tree. What's this for? I asked, touched. It's a reminder, he said. No matter what happens, our roots stay strong. I closed my hand around it, feeling tears sting my eyes. For so long I had worried about losing my place in his life. Now I understood that love built over years cannot be erased by a single person's words. The following spring, Daniel invited me to a charity event hosted by his firm. As we walked into the room together, I felt a moment of nervousness, remembering the whispers that once followed us. But this time people greeted us warmly, asking about our work, our lives, our plans for the future. The shadows of the past seemed distant, almost unreal. At the end of the night, as we stepped outside into the cool air, Daniel looked at me with a soft smile. "Thank you," he said. "For what?" "For never giving up on me, even when I didn't see what was right in front of me." I reached up and straightened his collar like I used to when he was a boy. "That's what mothers do," I said gently. We walked toward the car together, the city lights reflecting in puddles on the pavement. The future felt wide and open, no longer shaped by someone else's expectations or ambitions. It belonged to us, to the quiet strength we had rebuilt, to the bond that had survived heartbreak and betrayal. And as we drove home, laughter filling the car, I realized something I hadn't allowed myself to believe before. Losing that wedding hadn't been the end of our story. It had been the moment we found our way back to each other, stronger and more certain than ever before. Spring turned into summer, and with it came a kind of peace I hadn't felt in years. The house no longer felt heavy with memories of what could have been. Instead, it carried the quiet rhythm of ordinary days, Daniel's footsteps in the morning, when he stopped by before work, the hum of the kettle boiling in the afternoons, the sound of laughter drifting through open windows in the evenings. One Saturday morning he showed up earlier than usual, holding 2 cups of coffee. He looked different, somehow lighter. "I signed up to volunteer at a legal aid clinic," he said, handing me a cup. "It reminds me why I wanted to be a lawyer in the first place." I smiled at him, proud in a way that felt deeper than words. "You always wanted to help people who didn't have anyone in their corner." He nodded slowly. "I think I lost sight of that for a while." We sat together on the porch watching the street wake up around us. Children rode bicycles down the sidewalk, neighbors waved as they passed by, and for the first time in a long time, everything felt steady. No chaos, no whispers, no looming threats, just the simple comfort of being present. One afternoon, as I was rearranging the living room, I found the pale blue dress folded neatly in the back of my closet. For months I had avoided looking at it, afraid it would bring back too many memories. But instead of sadness, I felt something else, strength. I decided to wear it to dinner that night when Daniel came over. When he saw me, he paused in the doorway. "You look beautiful," he said softly. "I figured it deserved another chance," I replied with a small smile. We went out to a small restaurant by the river, a place we used to visit when he was in college. The air smelled like grilled food and summer rain, and music drifted through the warm evening. As we ate, Daniel talked about new cases, about clients who reminded him of why empathy mattered more than winning arguments. At one point he grew quiet, staring at the water. "I used to think my life had to follow a certain timeline," he admitted, "get married, start a family. When that didn't happen, I felt like I failed." I reached across the table and touched his hand. "Life doesn't follow schedules," I said gently. "Sometimes the detours teach us more than the destination ever could." He smiled, and the tension that once lingered in his eyes seemed to fade a little more. As weeks passed, we built new traditions together. Sunday breakfasts turned into long walks through the park. Movie nights became a regular ritual, complete with homemade popcorn and old comedies that made us laugh until our cheeks hurt. Slowly, our relationship shifted from one defined by hardship to one filled with genuine companionship. One evening, while we were sorting through old photo albums, Daniel paused on a picture of himself at age 10, holding a handmade birthday cake. "You remember this?" he asked. "Of course," I said. "You insisted on decorating it yourself." He laughed softly. "I think I understand now how much you gave up for me. Back then I just thought it was normal." "It was normal," I replied. "Love makes sacrifices feel natural." He closed the album and looked at me with a seriousness that caught me off guard. "I want you to have your own life too, Mom." not just be there for me. The words lingered in the air. For years my identity had been wrapped around being his support system. Hearing him encourage me to focus on myself felt both strange and freeing. So I started doing small things just for me. I joined a local book club, took evening walks with neighbors, even signed up for a painting class despite insisting for years that I wasn't creative. The first time I showed Daniel one of my clumsy paintings, he grinned like it was a masterpiece. "I knew you had hidden talents," he teased. "I think you're biased," I replied, laughing. Maybe I was learning that life didn't end when children grew up. Maybe it simply changed shape. One night, once after everything had settled, Daniel came over with a thoughtful expression. "I ran into Jessica today," he said carefully. My heart skipped for a moment, but I stayed quiet, letting him continue. "She didn't say much," he explained. "Just that she hoped I was doing well." He paused. I didn't feel angry, just distant. I nodded slowly. "Sometimes closure isn't dramatic," I said. "Sometimes it's just realizing you've moved on." He exhaled, as if letting go of a weight he had carried for too long. Later that evening we sat outside, watching fireflies flicker in the garden. The air felt warm and peaceful, filled with the scent of blooming flowers. Daniel leaned back in his chair, eyes on the sky. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if the wedding went through?" he asked. I thought about it for a moment before answering. "Maybe we would have lost parts of ourselves trying to keep everyone happy," I said. "And maybe one day the truth would have come out anyway. I don't know. But I do know that we're here now, and that's enough." He smiled quietly, the kind of smile that doesn't need explanation. As the year drew closer to its end, we celebrated small victories. Daniel won his first major case at work, and invited me to the courthouse steps afterward. Watching him speak with confidence and compassion filled me with a pride that felt almost overwhelming. He wasn't just my son anymore. He was a man who had learned from pain without letting it harden his heart. That night, we sat in the kitchen sharing a late dinner. He raised his glass of lemonade with a playful grin. "To second chances," he said. "To new beginnings," I replied. We clinked our glasses together, the soft sound echoing in the quiet room. And as I looked at him across the table, I realized that the words spoken to me that night before the wedding had lost all their power. I wasn't extra baggage. I wasn't someone waiting to be pushed aside. I was a mother, a woman, a person who had endured heartbreak and come out stronger on the other side. The future no longer felt like something to fear. It felt like an open road stretching ahead, filled with possibilities we hadn't even imagined yet. And for the first time in a very long while, I felt completely at peace, knowing that no matter what came next, the bond between us would remain unbreakable.